The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of the Meridian Hotel's penthouse restaurant, crystal fragments catching the amber glow of the city lights 40 stories below. Marcus Aldridge didn't flinch at the sound. He was too busy staring at the woman who had just destroyed his world with 7 simple words. "Your partner is betraying you, Mr. Aldridge." The waitress stood frozen beside their table, her serving tray trembling in her hands. She was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes that seemed too old for her face and dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her name tag read Sofia, and the burgundy uniform of the Meridian staff looked freshly pressed despite the late hour. But it was her expression that caught Marcus off guard, not the practiced politeness of service industry training, but genuine concern etched into every line of her face. Across the table, Victoria Chen's perfectly manicured fingers had gone still around her own glass. Marcus watched as his business partner and fiancée of 3 years composed herself with the calculated precision that had made her one of the most feared corporate lawyers in Manhattan. Her smile returned like a mask sliding back into place, but Marcus had caught the flash of something dangerous in her dark eyes. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Victoria's voice carried that deceptively soft tone Marcus knew meant someone was about to be destroyed. Sofia's throat worked as she swallowed hard. The restaurant around them hummed with the quiet conversations of Manhattan's elite. Tech moguls discussing acquisitions over Wagyu beef, pharmaceutical heiresses negotiating charity donations between courses of molecular gastronomy. None of them paid attention to the drama unfolding at table 12, where a billionaire's empire hung in the balance of a waitress's courage. I heard you talking earlier," Sofia stammered, her accent carrying traces of somewhere far from New York's concrete canyons. "When you were in the private dining room, about the Singapore deal, about moving the money to the Cayman accounts before—" "That's enough!" Victoria's interruption sliced through the air like a blade. She stood with fluid grace, her Armani dress moving like liquid shadow. "Marcus, clearly this establishment has a problem with staff professionalism. Perhaps we should take our business elsewhere." But Marcus remained seated, his steel-gray eyes fixed on Sofia's face. At 42, he had built Aldridge Industries from a small tech startup into a global empire worth $8 billion. He hadn't done it by ignoring warning signs, no matter how inconvenient their timing. The waitress was terrified, yes, but there was something else there. A desperate honesty that reminded him of himself 20 years ago, when he'd been just another hungry entrepreneur willing to risk everything for the truth. "What exactly did you hear?" he asked quietly. Sofia's eyes darted between them, her grip on the serving tray whitening her knuckles. The restaurant's ambient lighting cast deep shadows across her face, but Marcus could see the internal battle playing out there. Fear warring against conscience, self-preservation fighting against what was right. "Marcus, please." Victoria's hand found his shoulder, her touch light but insistent. Her perfume, some expensive French concoction that probably cost more than Sofia made in a month, seemed suddenly cloying. "This is inappropriate. We can't let service staff interrupt our evening with their fantasies." The word fantasies landed with particular cruelty, designed to wound and dismiss in equal measure. Marcus watched Sofia flinch as if she'd been slapped, saw the way her chin lifted despite the hurt in her eyes. There was pride there, battered but unbroken. "I don't make things up," Sofia said, her voice stronger now. "I was clearing the other room when you were on the phone. You were talking about how the Singapore acquisition was going to fail, how you had already moved the emergency funds to accounts that Mr. Aldridge couldn't access. You said—" she took a shaky breath, "you said once the deal collapsed, you'd have enough liquidity to buy out his shares at pennies on the dollar." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. The Singapore deal, a massive expansion into Southeast Asian markets that either established Aldridge Industries as a true global powerhouse or cost them everything they'd built. It was risky, ambitious, and entirely his vision. Victoria had argued against it for months, citing market volatility and overextension concerns.
In the end, she'd agreed to support it, even putting up her own firm's resources as collateral. Or so he'd thought. "That's preposterous," Victoria laughed, but the sound was too sharp, too quick. "Marcus, darling, you know how much I've supported this deal. My firm has invested millions."
"In the Cayman accounts," Sofia interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the sudden silence that seemed to have fallen over their corner of the restaurant. "You mentioned the Cayman accounts specifically. You said once Aldridge Industries went under, you'd use those funds to buy up the assets through shell companies." Marcus felt the world tilt beneath him. The Cayman accounts? He'd established them years ago for legitimate tax purposes, but Victoria had been managing them for the past 18 months. As his partner in business and life, she had full access, full authority. It would have been so easy, so subtle, a series of perfectly legal financial maneuvers that would leave him bankrupt and her holding the keys to his empire. The engagement ring on Victoria's finger, a flawless 10-carat diamond that had cost him more than most people's houses, caught the light as her hand moved to her purse. Everything about her screamed expensive perfection. The designer dress, the shoes that probably cost 5 figures, the subtle jewelry that spoke of generational wealth. She was beautiful, brilliant, and, as Marcus was beginning to realize, utterly ruthless. "This is absurd," Victoria said, her voice carrying across the restaurant with enough force to draw glances from nearby tables. "Marcus, I can't believe you're entertaining this fantasy from some delusional waitress who's probably angling for a tip or—" "I'm not," Sofia said firmly. I couldn't let it happen. Not when I knew." "Knew what, exactly?" Victoria's tone had gone deadly quiet. "Knew that he trusted you." Sofia's eyes found Marcus's across the table. "I've served your table before. I've seen how you look at her, how you talk about building something together. And I've been where you are, trusted someone who was supposed to protect me and watched them destroy everything I cared about instead." The pain in her voice was raw, unguarded, speaking of wounds that hadn't fully healed. Marcus found himself leaning forward, caught by the unexpected depth of emotion from this stranger who was risking everything to warn him. "This is absurd," Victoria said, her voice carrying across the restaurant with enough force to draw glances from nearby tables. "Marcus, I can't believe you're entertaining this fantasy from some delusional waitress who's probably angling for a tip or—" "I'm not," Sofia said firmly. I couldn't let it happen. Not when I knew." "Knew what, exactly?" Victoria's tone had gone deadly quiet. "Knew that he trusted you." Sofia's eyes found Marcus's across the table. "I've served your table before. I've seen how you look at her, how you talk about building something together. And I've been where you are, trusted someone who was supposed to protect me, and watched them destroy everything I cared about instead." The pain in her voice was raw, unguarded, speaking of wounds that hadn't fully healed. Marcus found himself leaning forward, caught by the unexpected depth of emotion from this stranger who was risking everything to warn him. "This is insane," Victoria hissed. "Marcus, we're leaving, now." But Marcus remained seated, his mind racing through months of small signs he'd ignored. Victoria's sudden interest in the Singapore deal's financial structures, her insistence on handling the offshore accounts personally, the way she'd been pushing him to formalize their partnership agreements, giving her more control over key decisions. Little things that hadn't meant much individually, but formed a devastating pattern when viewed together. "The private dining room," he said slowly. "What time was this conversation?" Sofia glanced at the slim watch on her wrist. Not expensive, but practical, the kind worn by someone who couldn't afford to be late. "About an hour ago, maybe 10:30? You had just finished your appetizers and moved to the window table for privacy." Marcus's blood went cold. An hour ago, he'd been in the men's room, taking a call from their Singapore partners about last-minute concerns with the deal. Victoria had said she needed to make a quick call to her office about an unrelated matter. He'd thought nothing of it. They both took business calls during dinner regularly. "Who were you talking to?" he asked Victoria directly. "Marcus, I will not be interrogated based on the accusations of some— Who were you talking to, Victoria?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Around them, the restaurant continued its expensive dance of Manhattan nightlife, but their table had become an island of tension in the sea of casual wealth and power. Victoria's mask finally slipped completely, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the polished surface. "You're actually going to believe her over me?" Victoria's voice carried a note of genuine surprise, as if she couldn't quite believe her control was slipping. "Marcus, I am your partner, your fiancée. We've built something together for 3 years. You're going to throw that away because some waitress claims she overheard something?" "I'm going to get to the bottom of this," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "If it's nothing, then we'll laugh about it tomorrow. But if it's something—" He let the implication hang. Sofia shifted nervously beside their table, clearly regretting her decision to speak up. The serving tray in her hands reflected the restaurant's warm lighting, casting shifting patterns across the white tablecloth. She was trapped now, caught between a billionaire's investigation and his partner's fury, with nowhere to run even if she wanted to.
The phone call. You weren't just talking about moving money. You mentioned someone named David. You said David had confirmed the Malaysian environmental permits were going to be revoked next week, right after the Singapore deal was finalized. You were laughing about how perfect the timing was. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. David Reeves, Victoria's ex-boyfriend from law school, who now worked for the Malaysian Ministry of Environment. Marcus had met him twice at industry conferences, found him arrogant and dismissive. Victoria had always brushed off questions about their past relationship, claiming it was ancient history. But environmental permits were the linchpin of the Singapore deal. If they were revoked, the entire expansion would collapse overnight, taking Aldridge Industries' liquidity with it. It would be the perfect storm Victoria needed, a legitimate regulatory failure that no one could blame her for, leaving Marcus's company vulnerable to exactly the kind of predatory buyout she'd apparently been planning. "You're in contact with David Reeves," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. Victoria's silence stretched for heartbeats that felt like hours. Around them, the restaurant hummed with oblivious conversation, merger discussions over brandy, real estate deals sketched on napkins, the casual exchange of millions that characterized Manhattan's elite dining scene. None of it seemed real anymore. Nothing seemed real except Sofia's frightened face and Victoria's calculating silence. "Of course I'm in contact with David," Victoria finally said, her voice carefully controlled. "He's a valuable connection in Southeast Asian regulatory matters. You knew that when we started exploring the Singapore expansion. But you didn't tell me about the permit issue." "Because there is no permit issue. This girl is either confused or lying." Sofia's intake of breath was sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm not lying. You said his exact words were that the permits were dead in the water by next Friday. You were talking about how the stock price would crater and you'd have 48 hours to execute the buyout before the board could react." Marcus felt something cooled settle in his stomach. Victoria was brilliant enough to orchestrate this kind of elaborate betrayal while maintaining the perfect facade of supportive partner. She'd been playing a years-long game, positioning herself to inherit everything he'd built while appearing to help him build it. The engagement ring seemed to burn on her finger now, a symbol of promises that apparently had been lies from the beginning. How much of their relationship had been real? Any of it? The late nights working together on expansion plans? The quiet moments when she'd talked about their future? The way she'd held him when his father died last year? Had any of it been genuine or just an actress playing the longest con in corporate history? "I think," Marcus said quietly, "we need to have a very different conversation than I thought we were having tonight." Victoria's composure cracked just slightly, a hairline fracture in her perfect control. "Marcus, please, don't let some stranger destroy what we've built together." But Sofia wasn't finished. "There's one more thing," she said, her voice barely audible now. About the insurance policies." The world stopped. Marcus had taken out massive Cayman insurance policies on himself when the Singapore deal was finalized, standard practice for a CEO undertaking such a risky expansion. If something happened to him, the policies would pay out enough to keep Aldridge Industries afloat during the transition of power. Victoria, as his business partner and designated successor, would be the primary beneficiary. "What about the insurance policies?" he asked, though he was no longer sure he wanted to know the answer. Sofia's eyes filled with tears she was fighting not to shed. She mentioned something about how much simpler everything would be if the policies had to pay out. She was talking to someone about making sure you were on the Singapore flight next week when everything fell apart. Something about how stress-related incidents were so common in high-pressure business situations. The implication hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. Victoria wasn't just planning to destroy his company, she was planning to destroy him. The Singapore trip, which he'd scheduled to personally manage the crisis when the permits were revoked, would be the perfect place for a convenient accident. A heart attack brought on by business stress, a tragic fall from a hotel balcony during a moment of despair. So many ways for a devastated CEO to meet an untimely end, leaving his brilliant partner to heroically rebuild his legacy while controlling his empire. Marcus looked at Victoria, really looked at her for the first time in years. The woman he'd planned to marry, to build a life with, to trust with everything he'd worked for. Her face was a study of controlled fury, the mask of loving partnership finally abandoned in favor of something far more honest and infinitely more dangerous. "You were going to kill me," he said, not a question, just a statement of terrible fact. Victoria's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Don't be dramatic, Marcus. You're letting your imagination run away with you."
But her denial came too late, delivered with too little conviction. Marcus saw the truth now, written in every line of her posture, every careful word she'd spoken tonight. The woman he loved had been planning his murder with the same meticulous attention to detail she brought to hostile corporate takeovers. Sofia stood frozen beside their table, her serving tray forgotten, her face pale with the realization of what she'd uncovered. She'd thought she was exposing financial betrayal, bad enough but survivable. Instead, she'd stumbled into a conspiracy that included murder, one that would now target her as the only witness who could tie Victoria to the plot. "I should go," Sofia whispered, backing away from the table. "No," Marcus turned firmly. "You should stay exactly where you are, because right now, you might be the only thing standing between me and a very convenient accident." The restaurant around them continued its oblivious dance of wealth and power, none of the other diners aware that they were witnessing the collapse of one of Manhattan's most prominent power couples. The city lights twinkled 40 stories below, beautiful and merciless, illuminating a world where love and betrayal walked hand in hand, where trust was just another commodity to be traded, and where a waitress's courage might be the only thing between a billionaire and his grave. Marcus reached for his phone, his fingers steady despite the chaos in his chest. "I think it's time to make some calls." The call to his head of security lasted exactly 93 seconds. Marcus had learned years ago to measure crisis conversations by duration. Anything under 2 minutes meant the problem was manageable. Anything over 5 minutes meant someone's career was about to end. 93 seconds meant James Morrison, his ex-Special Forces security chief, understood exactly what was needed without lengthy explanations. "Keep her close but comfortable," Marcus murmured into the phone, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face. "And I want a full audit of the Cayman accounts by morning. Everything. Every transfer, every authorization, every digital footprint." Victoria remained seated, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. She'd always been beautiful, but tonight Marcus was seeing something different in her features, a predatory patience he'd somehow missed for 3 years. How had he been so blind? Sofia hovered near their table, trapped between flight and responsibility. The serving tray trembled in her hands, and Marcus noticed for the first time the small details that spoke of a life far removed from the luxury surrounding them. Her shoes were well maintained but clearly old, resoled at least once. Her jewelry was minimal, a simple cross necklace and small earrings that caught the light modestly. No designer anything, no trust fund polish, just honest work and quiet dignity. "Sir, I should probably get back to..."
Please sit down, Marcus interrupted, gesturing to an empty chair. I think we're going to need to have a longer conversation. As if summoned by some invisible signal, James Morrison appeared at their table. 6'4" and built like the military hardware he once operated, James had the uncommon ability to blend into expensive surroundings despite looking like he could bench press a small car. He wore an understated black suit that concealed enough weaponry to handle most contingencies, and his pale blue eyes missed nothing. Mr. Aldridge, James nodded professionally. Ma'am, he acknowledged Victoria with the same courtesy he'd shown her for 3 years. Miss, he added, his gaze settling on Sofia with curious assessment.
Marcus watched the rapid calculation in Sofia's expression, the fear of losing her job warring with the larger fear of what she'd stumbled into. He could see her weighing options, considering consequences, trying to find a safe path through a situation that had already moved far beyond anything resembling safety. Victoria stood gracefully, collecting her purse with movements that seemed casual but felt practiced, as if she'd rehearsed this exact scenario. "Well, this has been illuminating," she said, her voice carrying just enough warmth to maintain plausible deniability. "I suppose I'll see you tomorrow, Marcus, after you've had time to think clearly about what's really happening here." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Tomorrow the Singapore deal would begin its carefully orchestrated collapse. Tomorrow Marcus would face the choice between financial ruin and a convenient accident. Tomorrow Victoria would discover whether her years of patient planning would finally pay off. "I'll be in touch," Marcus replied evenly. James offered Victoria his arm with perfect gentleman's courtesy, the gesture courteous and inescapable in equal measure. As they walked away between tables full of Manhattan's elite, Marcus caught fragments of their conversation, Victoria's laugh, bright and artificial, James's responses, professional and non-committal. To any observer, they looked like a successful lawyer being escorted home by attentive security, just another night in the world of high-stakes business relationships. Sofia remained frozen in place, watching them disappear into the restaurant's elegant lobby. When they were gone, she seemed to deflate slightly, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation finally beginning to ebb. "I think I just made a terrible mistake," she whispered. "Maybe. Or maybe you just saved my life." The weight of those words settled between them. Outside, Manhattan glittered with its usual indifferent beauty, 40 stories of steel and glass rising toward stars that were invisible behind the city's ambient glow. The restaurant continued its expensive dance around them, but their table had become an island of quiet tension in the sea of casual wealth and power. "Tell me about yourself," Marcus said gently. "Start with how you ended up here tonight, risking everything to warn a stranger." Sofia's laugh was hollow. "You really want to know?" "I really want to know." She set down her serving tray and sank into the chair Victoria had vacated, looking strange and out of place in the expensive setting. Her burgundy uniform was designed to help her blend into the background, to be invisible, while providing impeccable service to people whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small countries. But sitting in Victoria's chair, illuminated by the restaurant's warm lighting, she looked more real than anyone else in the room. "I came from Guatemala when I was 16. My mother had been working here for 5 years, saving every penny to bring me and my little brother over. She worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, working in a laundry during the day, babysitting on weekends. She never stopped moving, never stopped hoping." Marcus found himself leaning forward, caught by something in her tone that spoke of depths beneath the surface. What happened? She trusted the wrong person. Sofia's fingers traced patterns on the white tablecloth, her touch light as feathers. "There was a man, Miguel Santos. He owned several businesses in our neighborhood, including the laundry where she worked. He was handsome, successful, generous with gifts and promises. He told her he loved her, that he wanted to help us build a life in America." The parallel to his own situation wasn't lost on Marcus. Different world, different stakes, but the same fundamental betrayal, trust weaponized, love used as a tool for destruction.
He convinced her to put her life savings into a business partnership, a restaurant that would serve our community, bring authentic food to homesick immigrants. She would handle the cooking, he would manage the business side. Everything legal, everything legitimate. She signed papers she couldn't read, trusting him to protect her interests. Sofia's voice carried the weight of old pain, wounds that had scarred over but never fully healed. Marcus recognized the tone, the same careful control he'd used when talking about his father's death, the measured distance required to discuss tragedies that had shaped but not broken you. 2 months after she signed over her savings, Miguel disappeared. The restaurant was just a front. He'd been using it to launder money for a drug operation. When the police raided the place, they found my mother's name on all the financial documents. Miguel had made sure she was the one who looked guilty. What happened to her? Deportation proceedings. The lawyer said she might avoid prison if she cooperated, testified against people she'd never met, about crimes she'd never committed. She refused, said she'd rather go back to Guatemala with her dignity than stay in America as an informant.
Marcus felt something twist in his chest. The courage required to make that choice, to choose integrity over safety, principle over survival, was the same courage that had brought Sofia to his cable tonight. She'd recognized the betrayal playing out before her and acted on a moral imperative that transcended self-interest. "So you stayed here alone?" "With my brother. Carlos was only 14 and someone had to take care of him. I'd been working part-time at a grocery store while finishing high school, but I had to find something that paid better. The Meridian was hiring, and the tips were good enough to keep us afloat." Sofia gestured around the restaurant's expensive appointments, the crystal and silver and imported flowers that cost more than most people's monthly salary. "I've been here for 7 years now, watching people like—" She paused, seeming to realize she was about to criticize his lifestyle to his face. "People like me," Marcus finished for her. "I wasn't going to say that, but you were thinking it." Sofia met his eyes directly, her gaze clear and unashamed. "I was thinking about people who have so much that they can't imagine what it feels like to lose everything. People who've never had to choose between rent and groceries, or decide whether to buy medicine or pay for heat. People who've never watched someone they love suffer because they trusted the wrong person." The words should have stung, but Marcus found himself nodding instead. She was right, of course. His wealth had insulated him from the kinds of desperate choices she'd faced, had given him options that someone like Sofia could never take for granted. But it had also made him vulnerable in ways he'd never considered. Wealthy enough to be worth destroying, successful enough to inspire the kind of patient, elaborate betrayal Victoria had orchestrated. "When I saw what was happening to you tonight, I saw my mother all over again. Someone trusting, someone generous, someone who believed in partnership and love and building something together. And I saw Miguel in her." She didn't need to specify who her referred to. "I couldn't just watch it happen again. I couldn't serve dessert and pretend I hadn't heard what I heard." Marcus studied her face in the restaurant's warm lighting. 7 years of serving Manhattan's elite had given her a practiced invisibility, the ability to blend into expensive surroundings without disturbing the illusion of effortless privilege. But beneath that professional camouflage was something Victoria had never possessed: genuine integrity, the kind that couldn't be purchased or negotiated or compromised away for convenience. "What about Carlos, your brother?" Sofia's expression brightened for the first time since she had approached their table. "He's in his last year at NYU, pre-med. He wants to be a pediatric surgeon, help kids who can't afford the best medical care. He's been working as a research assistant while he studies, and his grades are good enough for any medical school in the country." Pride radiated from her voice, the fierce protective love of an older sister who'd sacrificed everything to give her brother a chance at the American dream her mother had died trying to provide. Marcus understood that kind of dedication. He'd felt it for his company, for the employees whose livelihoods depended on Aldridge Industries' continued success, for the vision of technological progress that had driven him for 20 years. "You put him through college?" We put him through together. He works, I work, we share everything. Same way we did when we were kids and it was just the two of us figuring out how to survive in a new country." Sofia's smile was soft but fierce. "He doesn't know what I spend on his education, and I don't tell him when I pick up extra shifts to cover his textbooks. That's not his burden to carry." Marcus felt something shift in his understanding of what courage actually meant. He'd always thought of it in terms of corporate risk-taking, the boldness required to bet everything on untested technology or emerging markets. But Sofia's courage was different, quieter, more sustained, focused not on building empires, but on protecting the people she loved. She'd been practicing heroism for 7 years, one shift at a time, one sacrifice at a time, without recognition or reward beyond the knowledge that she was keeping her family's hopes alive. And now you've risked all of that to warn a stranger about something that's none of your business, he observed. "It became my business the moment I heard it. My mother taught me that we're responsible for each other, whether we want to or not. She said indifference is just another form of cruelty, and we'd experienced enough cruelty for one lifetime." The restaurant around them had begun to empty as the evening wound toward midnight. The other tables were settling their checks, the conversations growing quieter, the energy shifting from the aggressive networking of early evening to the more intimate connections that survived past last call. Marcus and Sofia sat in a bubble of unusual honesty. Two people from completely different worlds finding common ground in the wreckage of betrayal and the possibility of trust. What happens now? To you, I mean, and to her.
Marcus considered the question carefully. In the space of 2 hours, his entire future had been rewritten. The woman he'd planned to marry was plotting his murder. The business empire he'd built was under assault from within. The expansion into Singapore that was supposed to be his legacy was designed to be his downfall. Everything he'd believed about his life had been revealed as carefully constructed fiction. But sitting across from Sofia, watching her face in the restaurant's dimming light, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The possibility of genuine connection with someone who saw him clearly and chose to help anyway. Not because of what he could do for her, not because of what she might gain, but because it was simply the right thing to do. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I'm not getting on that plane to Singapore." The emergency board meeting convened at 6:47 a.m. in the glass-walled conference room on the 52nd floor of Aldridge Industries Tower. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan spread out like a circuit board, all gleaming surfaces and pulsing energy, oblivious to the corporate drama unfolding high above its streets. Marcus sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, flanked by 8 men and women who collectively controlled billions in assets and influenced the careers of tens of thousands of employees. These were his closest advisors, his trusted inner circle, people he'd worked with for years to build Aldridge Industries from ambitious startup to global powerhouse. This morning, he was about to discover how many of them already knew what Victoria had been planning. James Morrison stood behind Marcus's chair, his presence both protective and intimidating. The morning light revealed new details about the security chief, the way his eyes constantly scanned the room, cataloging exits and potential threats, the subtle bulge of concealed weapons beneath his expertly tailored jacket, the absolute stillness that suggested coiled violence held in perfect check. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Marcus began, his voice carrying easily through the conference room's acoustically perfect space. "We have a situation that requires immediate attention." Board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. These were people accustomed to carefully planned meetings with detailed agendas distributed days in advance, not emergency sessions called before dawn with cryptic explanations. Helen Reeves, his CFO for the past 8 years, looked particularly tense,
her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of hasty preparation. "Where's Victoria?" asked Dr. Richard Hawthorne, the company's chief technology officer and one of Marcus's oldest friends. "Shouldn't she be here for whatever this is about?" "Victoria," Marcus said carefully, "is the subject we need to discuss." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Board members exchanged glances, the kind of careful eye contact that suggested shared knowledge they hoped Marcus hadn't discovered. The morning light streaming through the windows cast sharp shadows across faces that had suddenly gone very still. "I'm going to be direct," Marcus continued. "Last night, I learned that someone has been systematically undermining the Singapore expansion with the apparent goal of bankrupting Aldridge Industries and acquiring our assets at fire sale prices. The same someone has been moving funds from our emergency reserves to offshore accounts I cannot access, timing these transfers to maximize damage when the expansion fails." Helen Reeves' hand moved unconsciously to her throat, touching a small pendant that Marcus now remembered Victoria giving her last Christmas. "Marcus, that's a very serious accusation. Do you have proof?" "I have a witness who overheard detailed conversations about the plan, including discussions about ensuring the Malaysian environmental permits would be revoked precisely when they would cause maximum damage to our position." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus watched each face around the table, noting who looked genuinely surprised and who looked like they'd been dreading this moment for months. Dr. Hawthorne appeared shocked, his scientific mind visibly processing the implications. Marketing Director Janet Walsh seemed confused but increasingly alarmed. But three board members, Helen, Operations Chief David Chang, and Legal Counsel Patricia Manning, all wore expressions of people whose carefully laid plans were suddenly falling apart. "Richard," Marcus said to Dr. Hawthorne, "I need you to run a complete audit of our Singapore technical specifications, every environmental impact study, every permit application, every regulatory filing. I want to know if there are any problems we haven't been told about." "Of course," Richard replied immediately. "Though I have to say our environmental compliance has been exemplary. We've exceeded every regulatory requirement by significant margins." "Helen, I need a full accounting of our cash reserves and offshore holdings. Every penny, every account, every authorization for fund transfers in the past 6 months. Helen's composure cracked slightly. "Marcus, you know that's a massive undertaking. It could take weeks to—" "You have until noon today," Marcus cut her off. "James will provide any assistance you need." James nodded silently, his pale eyes fixed on Helen with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey. Helen shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, her professional confidence wavering. "Janet, I want you to reach out to our Singapore partners. Tell them we're conducting an internal review of the expansion timeline and need to verify all regulatory approvals are still on track. Don't mention any specific concerns, just routine due diligence." "Absolutely," Janet agreed, already making notes on her tablet. Marcus turned to the 3 board members he suspected of complicity. "Patricia Manning, I need you to review all partnership agreements between Aldridge Industries and Victoria's law firm. Every contract, every payment, every representation of authority. I want to understand exactly what powers we've granted and how they might be misused." Patricia Manning's face had gone pale beneath her expertly applied makeup. She'd been a skilled corporate lawyer, but she'd never been good at hiding her emotions when cornered. "Marcus, I'm not sure I'm the right person for that kind of review. There might be conflicts of interest." "Then recuse yourself," Marcus said flatly, but the review happens today. David Chang, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. Marcus, I have to ask, what evidence do you actually have? Because these accusations, they could destroy careers, relationships, the entire leadership structure of this company. If you're wrong, if I'm wrong, then we'll all have an interesting story to tell. But if I'm right, then we're about to prevent the complete destruction of everything we've built together. The conference room's door opened quietly, and Sofia entered, carrying a silver tray with coffee and pastries. She'd changed from her restaurant uniform into simple black slacks and a white blouse, her hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail. Despite the early hour and the gravity of the situation, she moved with quiet efficiency, serving each board member with the same professional invisibility she'd perfected at the Meridian. Marcus watched the board members' reactions to her presence. Most accepted their coffee with automatic politeness, barely registering her existence. But Helen, David, and Patricia all stared at Sofia with poorly concealed recognition and growing alarm. They knew exactly who she was and what her presence meant. "Thank you," Marcus said as Sofia reached his chair. Their eyes met briefly, and he saw the same determined courage that had brought her to his table the night before. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Sofia Morales. She's the witness I mentioned." The reaction was immediate and telling. Dr. Hawthorne looked puzzled but interested. Janet Walsh seemed intrigued by the unexpected development. But the three suspected conspirators looked like they'd been punched in the stomach. Helen actually dropped her coffee cup, the fine china shattering against the polished table and sending dark liquid across important documents. "This is highly irregular," Patricia Manning sputtered, her legal training finally kicking in. "Marcus, you can't just bring random people into confidential board meetings. There are legal implications, fiduciary responsibilities." "Sofia isn't random," Marcus interrupted. "She's someone who risked everything to prevent a crime. And as of this morning, she's also our newest consultant on corporate security matters." Sofia set down the serving tray and remained standing beside Marcus's chair, her posture straight despite the obvious tension in the room. The morning light streaming through the windows cast her face in sharp relief, highlighting the quiet strength that had enabled her to survive everything life had thrown at her. "Ms. Morales," Marcus said formally, "would you please tell the board what you overheard last night?" Sofia's voice was steady as she recounted the conversation she'd witnessed, the details about moved funds and revoked permits and convenient accidents. With each revelation, the division in the room became more pronounced. Half the board looked increasingly horrified, while the other half looked increasingly desperate. When she finished, the silence was broken by David Chang's bitter laugh. "So we're supposed to believe that Victoria Chen, one of the most successful corporate lawyers in Manhattan, Marcus's business partner and fiancée, has spent years orchestrating some elaborate murder plot based on the testimony of a waitress who doesn't even work here?" "I work at the Meridian, where I've served your table exactly 7 times in the past 2 years, Mr. Chang. You always order the salmon, medium rare, with the wine pairing recommendation from our sommelier. Your wife orders the vegetarian tasting menu, and you always request a corner table because she doesn't like being observed while eating." David Chang's face went white. The specific accuracy of Sofia's recollection made it clear she had an excellent memory for details, lending credibility to everything else she had reported. "The question," Marcus said, "is how many people in this room already knew what Victoria was planning?"
Moving emergency operating funds to more liquid accounts in the Cayman Islands. Accounts that she said would be easier to access quickly if we needed to respond to market changes during the expansion. Helen's voice grew smaller with each word. She had all the proper authorizations, all the legal documentation. It seemed prudent
Marcus felt the familiar cold sensation of betrayal settling in his stomach. Helen had been with the company for 8 years, had helped him navigate 3 major acquisitions and 2 hostile takeover attempts. He trusted her judgment completely, never questioning her financial recommendations. That trust had been weaponized against him with surgical precision. How much money are we talking about? $2.7 billion, Helen whispered. The number hit the room like a physical blow. $2.7 billion. Enough to buy controlling interest in Aldridge Industries if the stock price collapsed. Enough to rebuild the company from scratch with Victoria as the sole owner. Enough to make every board member in the room wealthy beyond imagination if they cooperated with the plan. "And you didn't think to mention this to me?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "She said you knew. She said it was your idea, that you'd asked her to handle the details because you were focused on the technical aspects of the Singapore deal." Tears started forming in Helen's eyes. "Marcus, I would never. I've been with this company since the beginning. You know I would never intentionally." "But you did," Sofia interjected, her voice gentle but implacable. "Whether you meant to or not, you helped move the money that was supposed to destroy him." Helen turned to look at Sofia directly, seeing her clearly for the first time. "Who are you to judge me? You don't understand the pressures, the complexity of these decisions. You serve coffee for a living." "I serve coffee, and I clean tables, and I smile at people who treat me like furniture, and I go home to a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens that I share with my brother. But I've never helped anyone steal billions of dollars even by accident." The quiet dignity in Sofia's response was more devastating than any angry outburst could have been. Helen flinched as if she'd been slapped, the full weight of her actions finally becoming clear. Patricia Manning tried to take control of the situation. "This is all very dramatic, but we're talking about financial restructuring, not criminal conspiracy. Moving company funds between legitimate accounts is standard corporate practice, without proof of criminal intent." Patricia. "How long have you been sleeping with David Chang?" The question detonated in the conference room like a grenade. Patricia went rigid with shock, while David half rose from his chair, his face cycling through rage, denial, and resignation in rapid succession. The other board members looked stunned, pieces of a puzzle they hadn't realized they were solving suddenly clicking into place. That's completely inappropriate," Patricia stammered. "I don't have to answer." "You don't," Marcus agreed. "But the private investigator I hired 3 months ago when I started noticing irregularities in our legal billings already answered it for you. Same investigator who documented your weekend trips to the Hamptons, your joint checking account, and your plans to leave your respective spouses after the Singapore deal made you wealthy enough to start over." Patricia and David exchanged glances across the table, a moment of communication that confirmed everything Marcus had suspected. Victoria hadn't been working alone. She'd built a network of conspirators, each with their own motivations, each with their own role to play in the destruction of Aldridge Industries. "It was supposed to be clean," David said suddenly, his voice hollow. "No one was supposed to get hurt. Victoria said the Singapore deal was overextended anyway, that it would fail on its own eventually. She was just accelerating the timeline, making sure the failure happened in a controlled way that would let us rebuild stronger." "Rebuild under her control, you mean?" Dr. Hawthorne said, his scientific precision cutting through the euphemisms. "She offered us equity positions in the new structure," Patricia admitted, her professional composure finally cracking completely. "Significant equity positions, enough to set our families up for generations." "In exchange for helping her commit murder." "No!" Patricia's denial was sharp and immediate. "Never murder.
We were told you would resign in disgrace when the expansion failed, that you'd probably have a nervous breakdown from the stress. Victoria said she'd step in as interim CEO, stabilize the company, buy back shares at reduced prices. It was supposed to be a corporate restructuring, not...
She trailed off, the enormity of what she'd almost been party to finally sinking in. Around the conference table, the other board members sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation that 3 of their colleagues had been planning to destroy everything they'd built together. Marcus studied each face, cataloging loyalties and betrayals, calculating the damage that had already been done and the work that would be required to rebuild trust within his organization. But beyond the corporate implications, he found himself thinking about Sofia, about the courage it had taken to approach their table last night, knowing that exposing the truth would make her a target. "There's more," Sofia said quietly, responding to some unspoken signal from Marcus. "Last night, after you all left the restaurant, I received a phone call." The room went completely still. Even the ambient sounds of the city 42 floors below seemed to fade away, leaving only the quiet hum of the building's climate control and the rapid breathing of people who suddenly understood that the game was far from over. "Victoria Chen called me at 2:17 a.m. She offered me $50,000 to recant everything I'd told you, to claim I'd misunderstood what I'd heard or that I'd been lying for attention. When I refused, she offered $100,000. When I refused again..." Sofia's voice remained steady, but Marcus could see the fears she was fighting to control. "She told me that terrible things happened to illegal immigrants who made trouble for important people." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Victoria hadn't just been planning corporate murder. She'd moved immediately to eliminate the witness who could expose her. The woman Marcus had loved, had planned to marry, had revealed herself to be something monstrous, willing to destroy anyone who stood between her and absolute power. "Did you record the call?" Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. James Morrison asked, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. Sofia nodded and pulled a small digital recorder from her pocket. "I learned to do this when my mother was going through the legal troubles. Always keep evidence of threats." She placed the recorder on the conference table and pressed play. Victoria's voice filled the room, cultured and cold, offering money and then threats, with the same casual tone she might use to order lunch. The board members listened in horrified silence as the woman they'd worked with for 3 years revealed herself to be capable of casual cruelty that took their breath away. When the recording ended, Dr. Hawthorne was the first to speak. "My God, Marcus, how long has she been planning this?" "Years, apparently. The Singapore expansion was just the mechanism. She's been positioning pieces on the board since shortly after we got engaged." Helen Reeves looked up from her hands, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. I believed..." "You believed someone you trusted. That's not a crime. It just makes you human." The compassion in Sofia's voice was remarkable given the circumstances. She'd been threatened with deportation and worse, yet she found empathy for the people who'd been manipulated into helping her tormentor. Marcus wondered what experiences had taught her such generous understanding of human weakness. Janet Walsh, who had remained silent through most of the revelations, finally found her voice. "What happens now? To the company, I mean, and to us?" Marcus considered the question carefully. The immediate crisis was contained. Victoria's plan had been exposed, the conspirators identified, the witness protected. But the damage ran deeper than financial manipulation or corporate betrayal. The very foundation of trust that held his organization together had been shattered, leaving him with the challenge of rebuilding not just a business, but the relationships that made that business possible. Now we figure out how to put this back together. Helen, Patricia, David, you're suspended pending a full investigation. If criminal charges are filed, that's a decision for law enforcement.
but your time with Aldridge Industries is over. The three conspirators accepted their fate with varying degrees of resignation. Patricia maintained her lawyer's composure, David looked relieved to have the deception finally ended, and Helen wept quietly for the career and relationships she destroyed through misplaced trust. For everyone else, Marcus continued, we have work to do. The Singapore expansion moves forward, but with complete transparency and new oversight structures. Every major decision gets reviewed by multiple independent parties. Every financial transfer gets verified through redundant approval systems. We are going to build safeguards that make this kind of betrayal impossible in the future. Dr. Hawthorne nodded approvingly. What about Victoria? Do we just wait for her to make another move? Marcus looked at Sofia, seeing in her face the same question that had been burning in his own mind.
Previous evening, Victoria Chen was brilliant, ruthless, and now cornered. People like that didn't surrender gracefully. They escalated. They doubled down. They sought to destroy whatever they couldn't control. The game was far from over. She's gonna come for all of us, Sofia said quietly, voicing what everyone in the room was thinking. People like her don't accept defeat. They find new ways to win. Marcus reached across the table and took Sofia's hand, a gesture of connection that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. Her skin was warm, her grip steady despite everything she'd endured. In the space of one night, she'd gone from invisible server to corporate whistleblower to potential target of a woman with unlimited resources and no apparent conscience. Then we'll be ready for her, he said. All of us. Together. Through the conference room's windows, Manhattan sparkled in the morning sun, 8 million people pursuing their dreams and ambitions in the greatest city on earth. Somewhere out there, Victoria Chen was planning her next move, calculating odds, identifying weaknesses to exploit. But here, 42 floors above the street, Marcus Aldridge was learning what real partnership looked like. Not the calculated manipulation he'd mistaken for love, but the genuine courage of people who chose to stand together against whatever darkness was coming. The war for his empire was just beginning. The first move in Victoria's counterattack came at 3:47 p.m., delivered with the precision of a surgical strike. Marcus was in his office reviewing security protocols when Janet Walsh burst through the doors, her face pale with panic, clutching her tablet like a lifeline. Marcus, you need to see this, now. The tablet displayed the home page of the Financial Herald, Manhattan's most influential business publication. The headline dominated the screen in bold, devastating type. Aldridge Industries CEO, under investigation for securities fraud and witness intimidation. Below the headline, a photograph showed Marcus and Sofia leaving the Meridian Hotel the previous evening, the image carefully cropped and captioned to suggest clandestine behavior. The story, written by Victoria's former college roommate Sarah Mitchell, painted a devastating picture of corporate corruption and abuse of power. Marcus read with growing horror as the article detailed credible allegations that he had been manipulating stock prices through false information about the Singapore expansion, using his position to intimidate employees who discovered his schemes, and most damaging of all, coercing an undocumented immigrant waitress into fabricating testimony against his business partner to cover his own crimes. "It's brilliant," he said grimly. "She's turned the entire narrative inside out." James Morrison appeared in the doorway as if summoned by telepathy. "Sir, we have a problem. Federal agents are in the lobby requesting access to your offices and personal records. They have warrants." The speed of Victoria's response was breathtaking. Less than 18 hours after her plan had been exposed, she'd managed to convince federal prosecutors to open an investigation, secured search warrants, and launched a media campaign that portrayed her as the heroic whistleblower exposing corporate corruption. Marcus had to admire the strategic brilliance, even as it destroyed him. "Where's Sofia?" he asked immediately. "Safe house in Brooklyn. But Mr. Aldridge, they're asking for her specifically. The warrant includes provisions for questioning all material witnesses." Marcus felt the walls closing in with claustrophobic intensity. Victoria hadn't just turned the narrative around, she'd weaponized the entire federal legal system against him. Sofia, who had risked everything to expose the truth, was now being painted as either a co-conspirator or a victim of his manipulation. Either way, her testimony would be discredited, her credibility destroyed, her immigration status scrutinized under a legal microscope. "Janet, get Richard Hawthorne on the phone. Tell him to secure all technical documentation related to the Singapore expansion, every environmental study, every permit application, every piece of evidence that proves our regulatory compliance." Marcus moved toward his office safe, retrieving documents and drives he'd hoped never to need. "Then call our legal team and tell them to prepare for a siege." The elevator chimed, and moments later, 3 federal agents entered the outer office area. The lead agent, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, introduced herself as Special Agent Sandra Riley from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Her credentials were impeccable, her manner professional but implacable.
"Mr. Aldridge, I have a warrant to search these premises and seize any documents related to the Singapore expansion project, offshore financial transfers, and communications with foreign government officials." She handed him a thick sheaf of legal papers. "You're not under arrest at this time, but I would strongly advise you to contact legal counsel immediately." Marcus scanned the warrant, his lawyer's training helping him identify the scope and implications of what was happening. Victoria had provided the federal prosecutors with an incredibly detailed roadmap of where to look and what to find. Every account Helen had accessed, every document Patricia had reviewed, every communication David had been privy to, it was all there in black and white, twisted into evidence of the very crimes Victoria herself had committed. "Agent Riley," Marcus said carefully, "I assume you're aware that the primary witness supporting these allegations is currently under threat from the actual perpetrator of the crimes you're investigating." "We're aware of multiple conflicting allegations," Riley replied diplomatically. "That's why a thorough investigation is necessary. Mr. Aldridge, we'll need to speak with Miss Sofia Morales as soon as possible. Her testimony is central to understanding what actually happened." The request sent ice through Marcus's veins. If federal agents interviewed Sofia without proper preparation, without legal protection, without understanding the full context of what she discovered, Victoria could easily manipulate the situation to destroy Sofia's credibility and potentially her freedom. An undocumented immigrant accusing a prominent lawyer of murder conspiracy would face skepticism under the best circumstances. Under these circumstances, Sofia could end up deported or worse. "Sofia Morales is under my personal protection," Marcus said firmly. "If you want to interview her, it will be with her attorney present and with guarantees about her immigration status." "Mr. Aldridge, you don't get to dictate the terms of a federal investigation," Agent Riley replied. "Miss Morales can have legal representation if she chooses, but she will be interviewed." James Morrison stepped forward slightly, not threateningly, but with unmistakable presence. "Agent Riley, might I suggest that rushing to interview a witness who has received death threats could compromise both her safety and the integrity of her testimony?" Riley studied James with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to reading dangerous men. "And you are?" "James Morrison, head of security for Aldridge Industries, and formerly Special Forces. I'm responsible for Miss Morales' safety at Mr. Aldridge's request." "Well, Mr. Morrison, federal witnesses are entitled to federal protection if needed. Miss Morales doesn't require private security." "With respect, Agent Riley, federal protection didn't help Karen Silkwood, and it didn't help a lot of other witnesses who threaten powerful people with deep pockets and patient plans." The reference to the murdered nuclear whistleblower hung in the air like a challenge. Agent Riley's expression suggested she understood exactly what James was implying about the forces arrayed against Sofia. Marcus's phone buzzed with an urgent text from Dr. Hawthorne.
Malaysian environmental permits approved this morning. All regulatory concerns resolved. Singapore expansion cleared to proceed. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Victoria's contact in the Malaysian government, David Reeves, had apparently decided to abandon ship, approving the permits that were supposed to be revoked to trigger the collapse of the Singapore deal. Marcus realized with growing clarity that Victoria's entire strategy was falling apart, which made her exponentially more dangerous. "Agent Riley," Marcus said, "I'd like to show you something that might change your perspective on this investigation." He led her to his office computer and pulled up the email from Malaysian authorities confirming permit approval. The timestamp showed 11:23 a.m., hours after Victoria's media blitz began, but exactly when she would have realized her original plan was no longer viable. "This permit approval was supposed to be revoked," Marcus explained. "According to the witness testimony you're investigating, the revocation was timed to trigger a financial collapse that would allow my business partner to acquire my company at a massive discount. Instead, the permits were approved, suggesting either the original testimony was false or the conspiracy has changed tactics." Agent Riley studied the documentation with the thoroughness of someone trained to spot deception. "Mr. Aldridge, this could just as easily be evidence that you manipulated regulatory approval through inappropriate channels." "It could," Marcus agreed, "which is why I suggest you speak with David Reeves at the Malaysian Ministry of Environment. I think you'll find his recent communications with Victoria Chen very illuminating." The suggestion was calculated to force Victoria's hand. If federal investigators started questioning David Reeves about his relationship with Victoria, her careful narrative of whistleblower heroism would collapse, but it would also escalate the situation beyond anything they'd dealt with so far, transforming a corporate dispute into an international investigation with implications none of them could fully predict.
"There's something else you should know," Marcus continued. "This morning, 3 of my board members confessed to participating in what they believed was a corporate restructuring scheme. They've provided detailed testimony about offshore fund transfers, planned stock manipulation, and promises of equity positions in a post-bankruptcy reorganization. That testimony is available to your investigation." Agent Riley's expression shifted from professional skepticism to genuine interest. Multiple witnesses confessing to participation in a conspiracy was the kind of evidence that transforms speculative investigations into serious criminal cases. "These board members are willing to testify officially?" Helen Reeves, Patricia Manning, and David Chang have all agreed to full cooperation in exchange for consideration during sentencing, Marcus confirmed. Their attorney can provide you with detailed statements and supporting documentation. The federal investigation was becoming a chess match with international implications, each move revealing new layers of complexity. Marcus realized that Victoria had made a crucial miscalculation. In her urgency to destroy him before he could expose her, she'd created a trail of evidence that implicated her in crimes far more serious than corporate theft. Janet Walsh appeared in the office doorway, her expression urgent. "Marcus, you have a call from Singapore. It's the Prime Minister's office." The room went completely silent. A call from the Prime Minister of Singapore during a federal investigation of the Singapore expansion was either incredibly good news or catastrophically bad news. Given the day's events, Marcus was prepared for the worst. "Put it through," he said. The voice that came through his office speakers was crisp, authoritative, and deeply concerned. "Mr. Aldridge, this is Deputy Minister Chen Wei from the Prime Minister's office. We understand there may be some irregularities related to your expansion project, and we wanted to assure you of our government's continued support." Agent Riley leaned forward, clearly recognizing the significance of receiving personal assurances from Singapore's government during a federal securities investigation. International political support was not something criminals typically enjoyed. "Deputy Minister Chen, I appreciate your call. As you may know, there have been some false allegations made about regulatory compliance,
but all proper approvals are in place, and we remain committed to the project. Indeed, we have reviewed all documentation and find your compliance exemplary. However, we have become aware of concerning communications between certain American lawyers and Malaysian regulatory officials that suggest attempts to manipulate our regional environmental policies for personal gain. Marcus felt a surge of vindication mixed with apprehension. Singapore's government had obviously been monitoring the situation, and their findings supported his version of events. But international intelligence agencies becoming involved in what had started as a personal betrayal suggested the stakes had escalated far beyond anything he had initially imagined. We would be very interested in cooperating with any investigation that helps maintain the integrity of regional regulatory processes, Marcus said carefully. Excellent. We will be in touch with the appropriate American authorities to share our findings. The call ended, leaving the office in heavy silence. Agent Riley stared at the phone with the expression of someone whose investigation had just become infinitely more complicated. "Mr. Aldridge," she said finally, "I think we need to have a much longer conversation about exactly what you believe happened here." Marcus's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from an unknown number. "You have 24 hours to withdraw all accusations and fire the waitress, or everyone you care about will pay the price. The building explosion at 432 Park Avenue last month wasn't an accident. Neither will the next one be. V." The blood drained from Marcus's face as he read the message. 432 Park Avenue, a residential tower where a gas explosion killed 3 people and injured dozens more. The official investigation concluded it was a tragic accident caused by aging infrastructure, but Victoria was claiming responsibility, threatening to repeat the attack with people Marcus cared about as targets. "Agent Riley," Marcus said quietly, "I need to show you one more thing. And then I think you're going to understand exactly how serious this situation has become." He handed her his phone, watching her expression change from skepticism to alarm to grim determination as she read Victoria's threat. "Mr. Morrison," Agent Riley said finally, "I think it's time for federal protection, after all, for everyone involved in this case." Marcus looked out his office windows at the Manhattan skyline, thinking about Sofia in her Brooklyn safe house, about his employees throughout the building, about innocent people going about their lives unaware that a brilliant sociopath was planning their deaths to protect her secrets. The corporate betrayal had become something much darker, much more dangerous. Victoria Chen had declared war on everyone who stood between her and absolute power. The only question now was whether they could stop her before she turned Manhattan into a battlefield.
3 weeks later, the war room on the 42nd floor of Aldridge Industries tower had been transformed into something resembling a military command center. Wall-mounted monitors displayed real-time feeds from security cameras positioned throughout the building and at key locations across the city. Federal agents worked alongside corporate security specialists, their laptops and communication equipment turning the elegantly appointed conference room into a high-tech fortress. Sofia sat at the far end of the mahogany table, her fingers moving steadily across a laptop keyboard as she compiled testimony that would form the backbone of the case against Victoria Chen. In the weeks since the story broke, she'd become something unprecedented, a witness whose credibility had been enhanced rather than destroyed by the attempts to discredit her. The federal investigation had revealed that every detail of her original testimony was accurate. Every threat against her was documented. Every piece of evidence she'd provided was corroborated by multiple independent sources.
"The Malaysian connection is solid," announced Special Agent Jennifer Park, the lead federal prosecutor who'd taken over the case from Agent Riley. David Reeves confessed to everything: the planned permit revocations, the coordination with Victoria Chen, the timeline for triggering the financial collapse. He's agreed to full cooperation in exchange for protective custody. Marcus looked up from the financial documents he'd been reviewing with Helen Reeves' replacement, Maria Santos, a forensic accountant who specialized in untangling complex corporate fraud. "What about the money?" "We've frozen all the Cayman accounts," Park replied. $2.7 billion in company funds that Victoria moved without proper authorization. The banks are cooperating fully. Apparently, Victoria's threats extended to their employees as well, and they're eager to assist the investigation. James Morrison entered the room carrying a secure phone and wearing the grim expression that had become his default over the past 3 weeks. Singapore Prime Minister's office just confirmed they have Victoria in custody. She was attempting to board a private jet to a non-extradition country when their security forces arrested her. The room erupted in a mixture of relief and exhaustion. For 21 days, they'd been living under federal protection while Victoria had remained at large, her resources and connections making her a constant threat. The knowledge that she was finally in custody felt like emerging from an underground bunker after a prolonged siege. "What charges is she facing?" Marcus asked. "Locally, fraud and conspiracy," Park replied. "Internationally, it gets more interesting. The Singapore government is treating her communications with Malaysian officials as an attempt to manipulate international trade regulations for personal gain. That's economic espionage, which carries much more serious penalties." Sofia looked up from her laptop, her expression thoughtful. Will she actually face consequences? People like her usually find ways to escape justice. It was a question that had haunted all of them throughout the investigation. Victoria Chen possessed resources, connections, and legal expertise that had allowed her to operate with impunity for years. Even captured, even facing overwhelming evidence, she remained dangerous in ways that traditional law enforcement struggled to address. "This time is different," Park said with conviction. "The evidence is overwhelming, the international implications are serious, and frankly, she made too many enemies. Half the legal community in Manhattan is volunteering to testify against her." Dr. Richard Hawthorne, who had been quietly reviewing technical specifications at his end of the table, looked up with scientific precision. "The Singapore expansion is proceeding ahead of schedule. All environmental permits are approved, all regulatory requirements exceeded, all international partnerships solidified. Victoria's attempt to destroy the project actually strengthened our position by forcing us to implement much more rigorous oversight and transparency measures." Marcus felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with profound exhaustion. The company had not only survived Victoria's assault, but emerged stronger, more ethical, more resilient. The board of directors had been reconstituted with new members chosen for integrity rather than just expertise. Financial controls had been implemented that made the kind of manipulation Victoria had attempted virtually impossible. Most importantly, a culture of transparency had replaced the insular decision-making that had made the betrayal possible in the first place. "There's something else," Sofia said quietly, her voice carrying across the room with unusual authority. Over the past 3 weeks, she had transformed from frightened witness to confident advocate, her intelligence and moral clarity making her an invaluable part of the investigation team. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean, we've spent 3 weeks focused on stopping Victoria, but we haven't talked about what we're building to replace what she tried to destroy." Sofia's eyes moved around the room, taking in the federal agents, the corporate executives, the security specialists who had become an unlikely team.
People, all of this expertise, all of this shared commitment to doing the right thing. What happens when the crisis is over? The question hung in the air with unexpected weight.
Marcus realized that somewhere in the process of defending his empire, he'd discovered something more valuable than corporate success, a sense of purpose that transcended profit margins and stock prices. The people in this room had risked their careers, their safety, their futures to prevent a grave injustice. They'd proven that ethical behavior wasn't just philosophically admirable, but practically essential for building anything worth preserving. "I've been thinking the same thing," Marcus admitted. "This whole experience has shown me how isolated I'd become, how much I'd been relying on trust instead of verification, on personal relationships instead of institutional safeguards. We built something remarkable together over the past 3 weeks. I don't want to lose that when we go back to normal operations." Agent Park looked intrigued. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we institutionalize what we've learned," Marcus replied, the idea crystallizing as he spoke. "Create a new division within Aldridge Industries focused on ethical corporate and accountability. Not just compliance with existing regulations, but proactive identification of potential problems before they become crises." Sofia leaned forward, her excitement evident. "Like an internal investigations unit?" "More than that, a comprehensive approach to ethical business practices that includes employee protection programs, whistleblower advocacy, transparency initiatives, and international cooperation on regulatory matters. We could become a model for how multinational corporations should actually operate." Dr. Hawthorne nodded approvingly. "The technical infrastructure is already in place. We've developed monitoring systems, communication protocols, oversight mechanisms that could be adapted for broader use. And the international connections we've built during this investigation," added Maria Santos, "could form the foundation for a new kind of business relationship, one based on genuine partnership rather than exploitation." Marcus looked around the room, seeing the same excitement in every face. What had started as a desperate defense against betrayal was evolving into something much more ambitious, a fundamental reimagining of how business could be conducted in the 21st century. "Sofia, I'd like to offer you the position of Director of Ethics and Accountability for Aldridge Industries. Full executive authority, substantial budget, complete independence from other corporate divisions. Your job would be to make sure nothing like Victoria's conspiracy could ever happen again, anywhere in our organization." Sofia's eyes widened with surprise and something that looked like hope. "Marcus, I don't have the background for that kind of responsibility. I'm a waitress who happened to overhear something important." "You're someone who risked everything to prevent an injustice. You're someone who maintained integrity under pressure that destroyed people with decades more experience. You're someone who sees clearly when others are blinded by self-interest or intimidation." He paused, struck by the certainty of his own words. "I can't think of anyone I'd rather have watching over the ethical foundation of everything we build." James Morrison, who had been silent throughout the exchange, spoke up with military directness. "Ms. Morales, in my experience, the best leaders are people who don't seek power, but accept responsibility when it's thrust upon them. You've already proven you have the courage for this job." Sofia looked around the room, meeting the encouraging gazes of people who had become far more than professional colleagues during their shared ordeal. These were individuals who had chosen principle over convenience, truth over safety, justice over personal advantage. They were offering her the chance to build something that could prevent other people from experiencing the betrayals that had shaped her life. "What about Carlos? My brother is still in medical school. I've been supporting him. Aldridge Industries has an educational assistance program. We'll cover his remaining tuition and expenses. And Sofia, the salary for this position is substantial enough to support your family comfortably while you build something that could change how business operates globally." Tears started forming in Sofia's eyes, not tears of sadness or fear, but of overwhelmed gratitude and possibility. For 7 years, she'd served other people's dreams while sacrificing her own, believing that survival was the highest aspiration someone like her could realistically pursue. Now she was being offered the chance to shape the ethical foundation of a global corporation, to ensure that other vulnerable people would never face the kind of exploitation that had destroyed her mother's dreams. She said, "I accept. But I have conditions." Marcus smiled, recognizing the same quiet strength that had brought her to his table 3 weeks earlier. "Name them."
First,
This division reports directly to the board of directors, not to any individual executive. No one person should have enough power to suppress investigations or manipulate outcomes. Sofia's voice grew stronger with each word. Second, we establish partnerships with organizations that advocate for immigrant workers, labor rights, and whistleblower protection. The people most vulnerable to exploitation are often the ones with the clearest view of what's really happening. Agreed on both counts, Marcus replied immediately. Third, Sofia continued, we create a fund to support people who report ethical violations, not just legal protection, but financial assistance for those who lose their jobs or face retaliation for doing the right thing. My mother lost everything because she tried to trust the wrong person. Other people shouldn't have to choose between feeding their families and exposing corruption. Agent Park leaned forward with professional interest. That's actually brilliant. Most ethics violations go unreported because the witnesses can't afford to lose their livelihoods. A fund like that could transform corporate accountability across multiple industries. It's more than brilliant, James Morrison added. It's operationally sound. The best intelligence comes from people who have nothing to lose and everything to gain from telling the truth. Marcus felt a surge of admiration for Sofia's strategic thinking. In the space of minutes, she'd outlined a comprehensive approach to corporate ethics that addressed not just procedural safeguards, but the fundamental power imbalances that made exploitation possible. Her understanding of vulnerability came from lived experience, giving her insights that no amount of academic study could provide. There's one more thing, Sofia said, her voice softer now. I want to visit my mother. The room went quiet. During the investigation, they'd learned more about Sofia's family history. Her mother, Rosa Morales, had been deported 6 years earlier after refusing to cooperate with federal prosecutors pursuing Miguel Santos's money laundering operation. She lived now in a small village outside Guatemala City, working as a seamstress and sending what little money she could spare back to her children in New York. I haven't seen her since the deportation. She doesn't know about any of this. About the case, about the job offer, about how her sacrifice to protect her integrity ultimately led to something positive. I need to tell her in person that her example inspired someone else to do the right thing. Marcus reached across the table and took Sofia's hand, a gesture that had become natural over the weeks they'd spent building trust under impossible circumstances. We'll arrange it immediately. Company jet, full security detail, whatever you need. And, he added, struck by sudden inspiration, we'll extend the trip to include meetings with Central American business leaders about implementing similar ethics programs internationally. Your first official act as Director of Ethics and Accountability can be building partnerships that protect workers across borders. Sofia's smile was radiant, transforming her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. For the first time since Marcus had known her, she looked completely free. Not just from the immediate threats they'd all been facing, but from the weight of survival that had shaped every decision she'd made for years. Dr. Hawthorne cleared his throat, drawing attention back to practical matters. Speaking of international partnerships, we should discuss the Singapore expansion timeline. With all the regulatory issues resolved and our ethical oversight systems in place, we're actually ahead of schedule for the first phase of operations. How far ahead? Marcus asked. 6 months. We could begin operations by the end of the year instead of mid-next year. The enhanced transparency requirements that Victoria's conspiracy forced us to implement have actually streamlined approvals with local governments. They trust our compliance now in ways they didn't before. The irony was profound. Victoria's attempt to destroy the Singapore expansion through regulatory manipulation had instead created such rigorous oversight that international partners now viewed Aldridge Industries as the gold standard for ethical business practices. Her betrayal had become the foundation for unprecedented trust and cooperation. There's something poetic about that, Sofia observed. Her attempt to corrupt the system ended up making it incorruptible. Agent Park began packing her files, the investigation team preparing to transition back to their regular duties now that Victoria was in custody and the immediate crisis had passed. Miss Morales, I have to say, this has been one of the most remarkable cases I've ever worked on. Usually, witnesses want to disappear after testifying. You've turned it into a career. My mother taught me that we're responsible for each other. This feels like living up to that responsibility on a larger scale.
As the federal agents and security specialists began filing out of the conference room, Marcus found himself alone with Sofia and the core team that would help rebuild Aldridge Industries into something better than it had been before. The war room was being transformed back into a normal conference space, the monitors and equipment that had defined their lives for 3 weeks disappearing into carefully packed cases. "It's strange," Sofia said, looking around the emptying room. 3 weeks ago, I was invisible, just someone who served coffee and cleared tables. Now I'm about to run a corporate division with international responsibilities." "You were never invisible," Marcus replied. "You were just surrounded by people who chose not to see you. That's going to change, not just here, but everywhere we do business." James Morrison, the last to leave, paused at the conference room door. "Miss Morales, Mr. Aldridge, it's been an honor working with you both. If you ever need assistance with security or investigations, you know where to find me." "James," Marcus called after him, "I'd like to offer you a permanent position as Director of Corporate Security, full authority over all safety and protection protocols for Aldridge Industries and our international partners." The ex-Special Forces operative smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression Marcus had seen from him in weeks. "I accept, sir. This company is worth protecting." As the conference room finally emptied, Marcus and Sofia found themselves alone for the first time since the crisis began. The silence was comfortable, filled with the satisfaction of people who had faced the worst and emerged stronger. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan sparkled in the late afternoon sun, the city continuing its relentless pursuit of dreams and ambitions while remaining unaware that one of its greatest corporate scandals had just concluded. "What happens now?" Sofia asked, echoing the question she'd posed weeks earlier in very different circumstances. "Now," Marcus said, "we build something worth believing in, something your mother would be proud of, something that proves her sacrifices weren't in vain." Sofia moved closer to the windows, looking out at the city that had tested her family so severely and was now offering unprecedented opportunities for redemption and growth. "She used to tell me that America was a place where people could reinvent themselves, where hard work and integrity could overcome any background. I never quite believed her until now." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She is. And she's going to be so surprised when I show up in Guatemala speaking English like an executive and wearing clothes that actually fit properly." Sofia laughed, the sound light and free. "Though I think she'll be more proud of the ethics work than the salary increase." Marcus joined her at the windows, studying the city spread out below them. Somewhere out there, thousands of other Sofia Moraleses were working invisible jobs, supporting families, maintaining integrity despite pressure and exploitation and indifference from people with power. The ethics division they were creating wouldn't solve every injustice, but it might make those injustices harder to ignore and more costly to perpetuate. "There's something I need to tell you," Marcus said quietly. "These past 3 weeks, working with you, seeing how you handle pressure and make decisions and care about people, it's changed how I think about partnership. Real partnership, not the kind Victoria was offering." Sofia turned to face him directly, her expression serious but open. "Marcus, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere in the middle of the worst betrayal I've ever experienced, I found something I didn't know I was looking for. Someone who sees me clearly and chooses to help anyway. Someone whose judgment I trust completely, whose courage inspires me to be better than I thought I could be." The confession hung between them like a bridge across the gap between their different worlds. Marcus realized he was taking an enormous risk. Sofia had every reason to be suspicious of powerful men who claimed to care about her, every reason to maintain professional boundaries that protected her independence and credibility.
I'm not Victoria. I don't want to control you or manipulate you or use you to build my empire. I want to build something together, both the ethics division and whatever this is between us, based on real partnership and genuine respect." Sofia studied his face with the same careful attention she'd shown him when evaluating his character that first night at the Meridian. "Marcus, you know that people will say I'm just another ambitious woman who seduced her way to a corporate position. They'll question everything I achieve, everything we build together." "Let them question," Marcus replied firmly. "Your work will speak for itself, your integrity will prove itself. And anyone who thinks they can dismiss you as just another ambitious woman will discover they've seriously underestimated the Director of Ethics and Accountability for Aldridge Industries and our international partners."
Sofia's smile was soft but determined. "In that case, I think we should probably start with dinner somewhere other than the Meridian. I'd like to have a conversation where I'm not wearing a serving uniform and you're not being betrayed by your fiancé." "I know just the place," Marcus said. "Small restaurant in Queens, family-owned, authentic Guatemalan food. The owner reminds me of someone who values hard work and integrity above everything else." "Perfect," Sofia agreed. "Though I should probably learn to cook something other than instant ramen if we're going to be building a future together." "We'll figure it out together," Marcus replied. "All of it. The ethics division, the international partnerships, the relationship, the whole complicated, beautiful mess of building something that matters." Through the windows, the sun was beginning to set over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reflected off the glass and steel surfaces of the city's endless ambition. 42 floors below, 8 million people were pursuing their own versions of the American dream, most of them unaware that the principles of integrity and accountability were about to become more than just corporate buzzwords at one of the city's most influential companies. Marcus and Sofia stood together at the windows, two people from completely different backgrounds who had discovered that shared values could bridge any gap, that courage was contagious, and that the best partnerships were built not on what people could take from each other, but on what they could create together. The war for Marcus's empire was over. The work of building something better was just beginning. "There's more," Marcus continued, his expression mixing excitement with concern. "We've received a request from the United Nations Human Rights Commission. They want to partner with the Institute to develop global standards for corporate accountability in developing nations." "That's incredible," Elena breathed. "Marcus, Sofia, you realize what this means. You're not just running a corporate ethics program anymore. You're reshaping how international business operates at the highest levels of global governance." Sofia moved to the windows overlooking Manhattan's bustling streets, thinking about the journey that had brought her from serving tables to advising international organizations. 44 floors below, the city continued its relentless pursuit of wealth and power, but now that pursuit was tempered by structures of accountability that made exploitation harder to hide and more expensive to maintain. "What's the latest on Victoria?" Sofia asked, though she already knew the answer would be complicated. Singapore courts sentenced her to 15 years in prison, but her legal team is appealing to international tribunals, claiming the charges represent political persecution of American business practices. They're well-funded and persistent. And David Reeves? Cooperating fully with investigators in exchange for protective custody. His testimony has led to corruption charges against officials in 3 different countries. The Malaysian government is using his case to justify major reforms in environmental regulation oversight. Sofia nodded thoughtfully. Victoria's conspiracy had been so elaborate, involving so many people across so many jurisdictions, that its complete unraveling was taking years to accomplish. Each month brought new revelations, new arrests, new evidence of how deeply corruption had penetrated international business relationships. But each revelation also strengthened the case for the kind of systematic reforms the Institute was promoting.
James called this morning. Helen Reeves has completed her community service and wants to contribute to the Institute's financial literacy programs. She says helping people understand corporate financial structures could prevent them from being manipulated the way she was. The offer represented a form of redemption that Sofia found both touching and strategically valuable. Helen's experience as both perpetrator and victim of financial manipulation gave her unique insights into how good people could be led astray by charismatic leaders with hidden agendas. Her willingness to help others protect from similar manipulation suggested that even the deepest betrayals could eventually produce something positive. "I think we should accept," Sofia said. "People like Helen, smart, experienced, genuinely remorseful, can be our most effective advocates for reform. She knows what warning signs to look for because she ignored them herself." Marcus smiled with the admiration that had become his default expression when watching Sofia work through complex ethical considerations. Her ability to find paths towards redemption and restoration, even in situations that seemed to call for punishment and exclusion, had shaped every program the Institute developed. "Speaking of redemption," Marcus said, "I have something to show you." He led Sofia to a corner of the main conference room where a scale model displayed the architectural plans for a new building project. The design was elegant but practical, featuring the same transparency principles that govern all Institute facilities. Lots of glass, open spaces, areas designed for collaboration rather than hierarchy. "What is it?" Sofia asked, studying the detailed miniature structure. "The Rosa Morales Center for Worker Advocacy, a facility in Guatemala City that will provide legal services, financial education, and job training for workers throughout Central America. I thought we could dedicate it during your next visit home." Sofia felt tears forming in her eyes as she studied the model more closely. The building was beautiful but purposeful, designed to serve the communities that had shaped her understanding of dignity and justice. Her mother's name would be permanently associated with programs that protected vulnerable workers from the kind of exploitation that destroyed her own dreams. "Marcus, it's perfect," Sofia whispered. She'll be so proud to see her name on something that helps other families avoid what we went through." She should be proud. Her courage in refusing to betray her principles inspired her daughter to save my life and build something that's changing how business operates globally. That's a remarkable legacy for a seamstress from Guatemala. Elena approached carrying a tablet displaying news coverage from around the world. "You need to see this," she said, her voice mixing excitement with disbelief. "The Institute just won the International Business Ethics Award from the Global Corporate Responsibility Council. Sofia, you're the youngest person ever to receive this recognition." Sofia read the news coverage with growing amazement. The award citation praised her work in transforming corporate accountability from theoretical concept to practical reality, creating systems of transparency and worker protection that have been adopted by multinational corporations worldwide. The ceremony would be held in Geneva, with representatives from 43 countries attending to honor the Institute's contributions to international business reform.
"This is surreal," Sofia said, laughing with a mixture of joy and disbelief. 3 years ago, I was worried about paying rent and keeping Carlos in college. Now I'm apparently addressing the World Economic Forum about corporate ethics." "And you deserve every bit of recognition," Marcus said firmly. "The programs you've designed have protected thousands of workers, prevented millions of dollars in wage theft, and created new standards for environmental protection that benefit entire regions. That's not surreal. That's the natural result of extraordinary dedication and moral clarity." Sofia studied her reflection in the conference room's glass walls, seeing a woman who looked confident and purposeful in ways that would have been unimaginable during her years of invisible service at the Meridian Hotel. The transformation hadn't just been professional. Her entire sense of what was possible had been revolutionized by the experience of building something meaningful with people who valued her judgment and respected her contributions. "There's something else," Marcus said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "Something I've been waiting for the right moment to discuss." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that immediately commanded Sofia's complete attention.
But instead of the ostentatious diamond that had once adorned Victoria's finger, this ring was elegant but understated. A simple platinum band featuring a modest emerald surrounded by small diamonds that caught the afternoon light with quiet beauty. "Sofia Morales," Marcus said, dropping to one knee beside the model of her mother's center. "Will you marry me? Not because I need you to help run my company, not because I want you to help me build my empire, but because I love who you are and who we become when we're together. Because I want to spend my life building things that matter with the most ethical, courageous, beautiful person I've ever known." The proposal was everything Victoria's calculated manipulation had not been. Spontaneous, honest, focused on partnership rather than possession. Sofia looked down at Marcus's face, seeing the vulnerability and hope that came with genuine love rather than strategic alliance. "Yes," she said simply, "but I have one condition." Marcus's smile was radiant with relief and joy. "Anything." "The wedding reception has to be catered by that family restaurant in Queens, the one where we had our first real date, where your wealth didn't matter and my background didn't matter, where we were just two people who had survived something terrible and decided to build something beautiful together." "It's a deal," Marcus laughed, slipping the ring onto her finger. "Though I should warn you, my guest list includes several heads of state now." "They'll love the authenticity," Sofia replied, admiring the ring's modest elegance. "Besides, if they're going to be working with the Institute on international accountability standards, they might as well understand what genuine partnership looks like." Elena applauded from across the conference room, her joy infectious. "This calls for champagne and planning sessions and probably a security review, given that you're both now high-profile targets for anyone who opposes corporate reform." The reminder of ongoing dangers was sobering but not intimidating. Sofia and Marcus had learned to build their relationship and their professional partnership with full awareness of the risks involved in challenging powerful interests. Their love had been forged in crisis and tempered by shared commitment to principles that transcended personal safety. 5 years later. The wedding reception was indeed catered by the family restaurant in Queens, though it required temporary expansion to accommodate guests that included the Secretary General of the United Nations, the Prime Minister of Singapore, and representatives from 36 countries where Institute programs had transformed labor relations. Sofia wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit, while Marcus wore a suit from the same tailor who had dressed his grandfather, a gesture toward family tradition that felt appropriate for someone whose empire was now built on principles of integrity rather than mere accumulation. Carlos Morales, now Dr. Carlos Morales, served as Sofia's escort down the aisle, having completed his residency at Johns Hopkins before returning to Guatemala to establish pediatric clinics funded by the Institute. His toast at the reception brought tears to every guest's eyes, describing how his sister's courage had not only saved his education, but inspired him to dedicate his career to serving communities that lacked access to quality health care. Rosa Morales sat at the head table, wearing a dress that Sofia had commissioned from Guatemalan artisans and beaming with pride as she watched her daughter marry a man who had proven himself worthy of her family's values. During the ceremony, she had placed her hands on both Sofia and Marcus's heads, offering a blessing in Spanish that the translator rendered as, "May your partnership strengthen each other and serve those who have no voice." Victoria Chen remained in prison in Singapore, her appeals having been rejected by every international tribunal that reviewed her case. Recent reports suggested she was writing a book about her experiences, though no publisher had expressed interest in her version of events. Occasionally, investigative journalists would contact the Institute asking for Sofia's perspective on her former adversary, but Sofia consistently declined to comment beyond expressing hope that Victoria would eventually find redemption through genuine accountability for her actions. 10 years later.
The second Aldridge Ethics Institute building opened in Geneva, designed specifically to house the Institute's new role as the official advisory body to the United Nations Commission on Corporate Accountability. Sofia's office overlooked Lake Geneva,
providing daily inspiration from one of the world's most beautiful settings as she continued to develop programs that protected vulnerable workers worldwide. The Institute's influence had grown beyond anything its founders had initially envisioned. Ethical compliance certification from Aldridge had become a prerequisite for major international contracts, with companies spending millions to implement transparency programs that met Institute standards. The Rosa Morales centers had expanded to 43 locations across 6 continents, providing legal services and advocacy for workers who had previously lacked any protection against exploitation. Marcus had transitioned from active management of Aldridge Industries to full-time work with the Institute, his business acumen proving invaluable in developing sustainable funding models that made ethical compliance profitable rather than merely admirable. The Singapore expansion had become the template for responsible international development, with environmental and labor protections that exceeded every previous standard. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural rather than institutional. A generation of business leaders had emerged who viewed ethical accountability not as a constraint on profit, but as the foundation for sustainable success. Young executives competed to work for companies with strong institute ratings, and MBA programs worldwide required coursework in the Aldridge model of corporate responsibility. "The quarterly reports from our African programs are remarkable," Sofia told Marcus over breakfast in their Geneva apartment, surrounded by the newspapers and tablets that kept them connected to institute operations worldwide. "Workers' satisfaction indices have improved in every country where we've established partnerships, and local governments are requesting expansions faster than we can train staff to implement them." "What about the resistance we've been facing from some American companies?" Marcus asked, referencing the ongoing political debates about international business accountability standards. "Senator Williams thinks the new legislation will pass by the end of the year," Sofia replied. "Corporate accountability requirements for companies with international operations, mandatory transparency reporting, protection for whistleblowers, everything we've been advocating for since the beginning." Marcus smiled with satisfaction, remembering the early days when their reforms had seemed impossibly ambitious. The systematic changes they'd envisioned during those first crisis management sessions were becoming legal requirements backed by the full force of international law. The apartment's phone rang with the distinctive tone that indicated a call from the Institute's emergency line. Sofia answered immediately, her expression shifting to professional alertness as she listened to her deputy director's urgent report. "There's been a major industrial accident in Bangladesh. Chemical spill at a textile factory that supplies clothing to several American retailers. Early reports suggest safety violations that should have been caught by existing oversight programs." Marcus was already reaching for his secured tablet, pulling up travel schedules and emergency response protocols that had been refined through a decade of crisis management. "How many casualties?" "Unknown, but potentially significant. The factory employed over 3,000 workers, mostly women supporting extended families." Sofia's voice carried the same urgent compassion that had driven her to approach his table at the Meridian Hotel 11 years earlier. "Elena is coordinating with local authorities, but we need to be on site as soon as possible." "I'll contact the pilots," Marcus replied, their emergency response routine activating with practiced efficiency. "We can be airborne within 2 hours." As they prepared for another international crisis, Sofia felt the familiar surge of purpose that had defined every important moment of their partnership. The work was never finished. The struggles for dignity and accountability never completely won, but each challenge provided an opportunity to prove that ethical principles could survive contact with harsh realities. 15 years later. The memorial service for Rosa Morales was held in the main auditorium of the Guatemala City Rosa Morales Center, with representatives from 47 countries attending to honor a seamstress whose courage had inspired a global movement for workers' rights. Sofia delivered the eulogy in both Spanish and English, describing how her mother's example had taught her that integrity was more valuable than security, principle more lasting than comfort. She never lived to see the full impact of her choices. She never knew that her daughter's work would protect millions of people worldwide from the kind of exploitation she herself had faced. But she would not have been surprised. She always believed that doing the right thing, even when it cost everything, would somehow create something beautiful for future generations.
The second Aldridge Ethics Institute building opened in Geneva, designed specifically to house the Institute's new role as the official advisory body to the United Nations Commission on Corporate Accountability. Sofia's office overlooked Lake Geneva, providing daily inspiration from one of the world's most beautiful settings as she continued to develop programs that protected vulnerable workers worldwide. The Institute's influence had grown beyond anything its founders had initially envisioned. Ethical compliance certification from Aldridge had become a prerequisite for major international contracts, with companies spending millions to implement transparency programs that met Institute standards. The Rosa Morales Centers had expanded to 43 locations across 6 continents, providing legal services and advocacy for workers who had previously lacked any protection against exploitation. Marcus had transitioned from active management of Aldridge Industries to full-time work with the Institute, his business acumen proving invaluable in developing sustainable funding models that made ethical compliance profitable rather than merely admirable. The Singapore expansion had become the template for responsible international development, with environmental and labor protections that exceeded every previous standard. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural rather than institutional. A generation of business leaders had emerged who viewed ethical accountability not as a constraint on profit, but as the foundation for sustainable success. Young executives competed to work for companies with strong institute ratings, and MBA programs worldwide required coursework in the Aldridge model of corporate responsibility. The quarterly reports from our African programs are remarkable, Sofia told Marcus over breakfast in their Geneva apartment, surrounded by the newspapers and tablets that kept them connected to institute operations worldwide. Worker satisfaction indices have improved in every country where we've established partnerships, and local governments are requesting expansions faster than we can train staff to implement them. What about the resistance we've been facing from some American companies? Marcus asked, referencing the ongoing political debates about international business accountability standards. Senator Williams thinks the new legislation will pass by the end of the year, Sofia replied. Corporate accountability requirements for companies with international operations, mandatory transparency reporting, protection for whistleblowers, everything we've been advocating for since the beginning. Marcus smiled with satisfaction, remembering the early days when their reforms had seemed impossibly ambitious. The systematic changes they'd envisioned during those first crisis management sessions were becoming legal requirements backed by the full force of international law. The apartment's phone rang with the distinctive tone that indicated a call from the Institute's emergency line. Sofia answered immediately, her expression shifting to professional alertness as she listened to her deputy director's urgent report. There's been a major industrial accident in Bangladesh. Chemical spill at a textile factory that supplies clothing to several American retailers. Early reports suggest safety violations that should have been caught by existing oversight programs. Marcus was already reaching for his secure tablet, pulling up travel schedules and emergency response protocols that had been refined through a decade of crisis management. How many casualties? Unknown, but potentially significant. The factory employed over 3,000 workers, mostly women supporting extended families. Sofia's voice carried the same urgent compassion that had driven her to approach his table at the Meridian Hotel 11 years earlier. Elena is coordinating with local authorities, but we need to be on site as soon as possible. I'll contact the pilots, Marcus replied, their emergency response routine activating with practice efficiency. We can be airborne within 2 hours. As they prepared for another international crisis, Sofia felt the familiar surge of purpose that had defined every important moment of their partnership. The work was never finished, the struggles for dignity and accountability never completely won, but each challenge provided an opportunity to prove that ethical principles could survive contact with harsh realities. 15 years later, the memorial service for Rosa Morales was held in the main auditorium of the Guatemala City Rosa Morales Center, with representatives from 47 countries attending to honor a seamstress whose courage had inspired a global movement for workers' rights. Sofia delivered the eulogy in both Spanish and English, describing how her mother's example had taught her that integrity was more valuable than security, principle more lasting than comfort. She never lived to see the full impact of her choices. She never knew that her daughter's work would protect millions of people worldwide from the kind of exploitation she herself had faced. But she would not have been surprised. She always believed that doing the right thing, even when it cost everything, would somehow create something beautiful for future generations. Marcus sat in the front row beside Carlos, both men wearing the same expression of profound respect for a woman whose influence on their lives had been transformational. Rosa had lived her final years in comfort, supported by her children's success, but more proud of their commitment to serving others than their personal achievements. Her final words to Sofia were simple. You kept the promise. You took care of each other.